Hi, welcome back to the podcast. And in this episode, I've got Matthew PG Murphy. Everyone who's been in third will know who exactly I'm talking about. Other people, well, you're going to find out who he is. Hey, Matt, how are you doing?
I'm all right, Frankie. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure's all mine. And like I said before, I really appreciate you doing this. It's just the normal questions that I tend to ask people. So it's the 5 questions. Where did you grow up? Why did you join the army? What did you do? What have you done since? And what's in the future for you? So if you'd just like to start by giving us a bit of a story of where you grew up and why you joined the army.
Yeah, well, so firstly, why am I here, Frankie? So I had a bit of a think, having listened to some of your excellent podcasts about whether I should come on and do this. And the stories that were coming out were so compelling. Some of them, really very hard hitting. That it actually reminded me of some of the questions that you just asked me there, and we'll go through them in turn. But ultimately, I've lived a slightly different existence than many of the people that you've had on the podcast. I had a very privileged upbringing, although I was part of a military family that moved all over the place. My father was in the Royal Air Force, and interestingly, he was a bomber air crew during the Cold War, which brought its own family dynamics. In that part of his role was to drop weapons on Russian target or Soviet targets back in the Cold War, and the chances of him coming home were pretty low. And my mum knew that. We didn't really know that as kids. And so, I grew up in RAF bases in what would have been called, BFG, RAF Germany, as they called it.
Yeah.
RAF Larbrook, and in Vulcan bomber bases in the UK when we had a big long range bomber force in the Royal Air Force. So that was my upbringing, and unsurprisingly, they chose to send me away to boarding school. I went to school in a place called Stamford, beautiful town, great school. Boarding was fine for me because I was a young reprobate boy that enjoyed doing all the things school allowed you to do. But my 3 sisters, a slightly different experience for each of them. So absolutely taught me the lesson when I reflected upon it, that what the schooling system is, is a totally unique experience for everybody. And one size doesn't fit all. So, deep down, I had a very privileged background, and unsurprisingly, with a military family, I decided that whilst I studied architecture at University College London, grew my hair, did some amazing design work, learnt a lot about London design culture, fabulous education at the Bartlett School of Architecture. I decided that I was going to pursue the military. So
a bit different, yeah.
Yeah, it was different, and that was interesting in its own right. On quite a selective design course at a university in London in the early 90s, for me to say, look, I'm going to go and join. I'm going to go and join the British military. And I ended up joining the British Army. They saw me as odd as the very diverse student population that we had on that course. Because of the nature of the course, they saw me as being very odd, because I was a privileged white bloke who decided that he was going to go and join the British Army. That, in many respects, helped me on my course, because everybody else was unusual. We had people from right across the world. Bearing in mind this was a long before really inclusive policies in society, etc. All sexual persuasions, all faiths, beliefs, cultures. were represented at my university, and I've found that to this day to have been a really important formative education. In many respects, whilst they would never acknowledge this, I found it really useful in the army as well.
Right.
I'd grown up in an education at university that was more diverse than the British Army would dream of aspiring to, even in 2024. And I was put through an education that was actually very intense and demanding in the way that the orders process, and officers communicating sometimes unpalatable orders to a hostile and need to be persuaded audience. That's what architecture as an education is all about. So
Yeah.
in a funny way, it was really useful as I headed towards the army.
So what made you pick the army over the RAF?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I did try to join the RAF. So I did a flying scholarship, so I know how to fly a plane. I've got sort of 10 hours solo on single engine aircraft. But then I failed the medical whilst I was at university, and so they wouldn't have me as aircrew.
Right.
Which was really the only thing that I was interested in the Royal Air Force. Once that wasn't an avenue I could pursue, late in my university career, I joined the Officer Training Corps, met a bunch of dudes that I really enjoyed being around, many of whom are still great mates, some of whom are still serving in the British Army. And just through that, that led me to applying to the Army as an officer and passing what was then called the RCB, the Regular Commissions Board, and starting at Sandhurst in November '94.
So why the artillery then?
That's a good question, and some of that comes back to some of the people that I'd met and how they treated me and how they looked after me in this sort of confused late teenage, early 20 years. When we all really don't know what's going on in the world. We don't really know what's going on in our lives, and we all need role models, mentors, and a lot of these people that I've met from the artillery, particular character that some will know called David Holly, who's a captain from 29 Commando, total reprobate, but a very decent man. And he treated people in the way that I would have expected. There wasn't a lot of arrogance. There was just straightforward engagement, and it was pretty compelling. And I decided that I'd have a look at them. I looked at other regiments as well. They all had their foibles and quirks, and ultimately, I made the decision that if the artillery wanted me, then I was gonna pursue them. They were a big family, diverse, plenty of roles. Let's give that a crack.
I mean, you've said you come from the military background, so turning up at Sandhurst, was that a shock to the system, or were you quite prepared for it? I mean, you mentioned that you're in the Officer Training Corps as well, so I suppose that would have.
I think my military background or my family's military background was of no use whatsoever. But the OTC to a degree, because there's a lot of people there, and they were being regular officers, and they were gobbing off about this, that, and the other, etc., etc. But actually, the thing that was most useful to me was the year before I went to Sandhurst, I had the opportunity to go to the United States to attend the U.S. Army's Reserve Officer Commissioning course.
Right.
For the British cadets, that was just a jolly to Fort Bragg in the US, and it was a shortened, like a sort of what once upon a time would have been the TA commissioning course.
Yeah.
One of the routes into the US Army, and we did the whole course, and it was really interesting. It was quite, there was some pretty challenging parts of it. In that it was a very austere existence. You know, it was something that you know, people going through phase one soldier training now would be familiar with. You know, austere barrack blocks, cleaning your M16 sort of 4 or 5 times a day, no cubicles in, you know, classic, you know, full metal jacket,
Yeah.
barrack block type territory. No cubicles in the heads in the block. Very diverse US culture. August, Fort Bragg, 40 degrees approximately, needing a lot of water. Different fizz culture than I found in the British Army subsequently. Lots of what would probably be sort of CrossFit type stuff. No, almost no running. They were not very good at running. They weren't very good at carrying weight. And I did that with a bunch of mates. Interestingly, you know, I had a British guy in my platoon. The rest of them were obviously all US, and that British guy, you know, went on and be very successful and was a brigadier in the Royal Marines, and did some special forces time, and you know, we keep in touch, and that was a very informative period for what then followed at Sandhurst, which, you know, it was you know, was amazing, but it was flipping intense.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And it's not an easy training establishment. So, you know, I think quite rightly, you know, the officers get given a bit of jip and are given, you know, maligned for a sort of easy life throughout their whole existence. But any senior NCO that's been an instructor at Sandhurst doesn't hold that view. No. It's very interesting that those that have been closest to it and have seen what officers are put through at Sandhurst for 11 months don't hold the view that it's all, you know, it's all jolly and about learning how to have dinners and stuff like that. It's actually a very tough training environment.
Yeah.
But you're young, and my view hasn't really changed much, but it's formed. That when you're young, you can really pretty much do anything you put your mind to if you're committed to it. And if you're committed to a career and you've started it and it feels aspirational at the time that you do it, like a 21-year-old going through Sandhurst, then you just grizz it and get on with it, and you learn so much that you're in this sort of professional training days as you go through that whole thing. Some things
Yeah, I spoke to Richard Collins. He explained about Rowan Troop and stuff like that, and went through some of the training they did at Sandhurst. And I mean, you know, I was just a buck shoe, really. I didn't, you know, you don't appreciate what happens there. And like you said, we look at the officers and think, yeah, they've got life easy now. But it has opened my eyes quite a bit that he touched on what actually they did at Rowan Troop before he actually got into Sandhurst and that, and you've kind of done that with the US course that you did. So that's give you a beat up to going into Sandhurst. And that really would have helped. Yeah. And the training, like you said, is intense, and the first part of it is basic military drills. You don't touch the leadership bit until later on.
Well, it's all woven in because they, you know, they unsurprisingly over years they've refined a course that got to a point where it was 11 months, but in there, the military skills are the vehicle to teach the leadership skills. So everybody is an infanteer at Sandhurst in the same way as everybody is in phase one soldier training, pretty much. But that lasts for 11 months, and so you can get quite a lot in that time. You know, I was there during a period where the commandant was Hugh Pike. Hugh Pike had been the commanding officer of one of the parachute battalions. I should know exactly which one it is, that did Mount Longdon.
Yeah.
And when he took over as the commandant, he effectively brought each of the P Company events over a period of the time. It wasn't P Company, but each of the was, you had 2 or 3 weeks to recover between each of them. And I had a buddy in my platoon whose brother was at the time the commanding officer of the Irish Guards, and so we would see him every now and again when father's dinner night or whatever it was, etc., etc. I remember talking to him. Sadly he's died now. Sebastian Roberts, amazing guy who went on to be the GOC London district, so the Household Division boss, and his view at the time as CEO of the Irish Guards was that Hugh Pike was producing cadets out of Sandhurst in the sort of early to mid 90s that could all go and do the first phase of selection, no problem.
Wow.
Because that was the sort of preparatory environment that was happening. Now, many of them wouldn't have had the aptitude, or almost none of them would have had the ability to pass Officers' Week. But in terms of they were in there, they were either sort of 18, 19 or 21 to 23 was at the time the sort of top age bracket. So they were in this very moldable and very fit part of their lives where they were thrashed for 11 months, and some of it was mental, but they were all being well prepared to take their place as leaders in the future British Army, and that was an amazing experience. But I wasn't. I've only been back to Sandhurst twice or 3 times since. Once for a platoon reunion, a couple of other bits and bobs, etc. I've never really sort of held it as as something that I personally found massively enjoyable, and I wanted to hang my. It was there to be got through. I learnt shitloads, and I came out the other side. And thankfully, I commissioned. And I've still got a whole bunch of great mates that were around at that time, and most of whom have been very successful in all walks of life.
So what was it like going to YOs then after you'd passed out from Sandhurst?
YOs was an absolute gift. It was almost like a post-tour decompression.
Yeah.
And was billed as much. But
I'm laughing. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm laughing there because I spent 2 years at Larkhill on an ARE, and many a times we've had to sweep that road up after the YOs have come in, or turned the guns back round after the YOs have come in off the piss. Yeah. Naughty boys, some of them.
Yeah, no, I was certainly in that bracket, but of course, it's rather built that way, and for a good chunk of time, definitely not the case now, but for a good chunk of time, that was part of the draw of the gunners to the young officer community, is that get through Sandhurst, turn up at Larkhill, and then really pick your avenue and have some fun en route to whichever regiment you want to go to. But in there, you are put under quite a lot of pressure to catch up pretty quick on your technical stuff, because almost nobody turns up there knowing anything about the art of science, which is gunnery, and people forget that there is a lot of science involved in gunnery, and you as the officer will find yourself in a compromised position if you haven't paid attention and know what you're doing. So there's a bit of that, but it was a lot of fun, and some really interestingly poor behaviour by us in all sorts of stuff with sheer lunacy, and some of it, but it was tolerated by as you say, you've done an ERE there, up to and including the commandant of the school. Luckily during the time that I went through, were absolutely tolerant that there were a bunch of post Sandhurst infantry dudes digging in, at Brecon or on on West Salisbury Plain, and then there were a bunch of gunner YOs that were learning some technical stuff and having a bit of laugh before they went off to their regiments, and that was seen as an attraction for officers of that wanted to have a bit of a laugh. Equally, there were some course, folk that were just preparing themselves to go and do the commando course, or going to go and attend P Company, shortly after they finished YOs. So it wasn't everybody that could really get away with gooning around. Largely what it was.
So when you get to YOs, do you get to pick? I mean, the question I want to ask is: do you get to pick your regiment that you want to go to, or what trade you want to specialise in? So if you want to go air defence, do you want to go?
No doubt it's changed significantly, but back then the senior instructor YOs, who's a major, but always a long in the tooth major, who has got a great reputation around the broad Royal Regiment, normally a sort of character that's been around, probably been a second in command of some regiment somewhere, probably is instrumental in keeping gunner sailing or riding or whatever going. So it's just sort of known by a mass community and knows each of the regiments because of the length of time that they've served. And there is this sort of, it's almost a sort of, then definitely, I'm sure it's not now, this sort of case where people will be asked to express an interest. Bear in mind that you don't really know what all these regiments do. And the SI would then nudge you into suggesting, no, I just think that you might be better suited if you did X or Y. And of course, we can't send, you're all young and, fit and playing a lot of sport. We can't send 10 people to 2-9 Commando or, 7 Para. So, let's be sensible about this. We need to, these are where the slots are. And I'm going to nudge and advise you over a coffee or a beer that actually you might be suited in going to this regiment or that regiment. And that's how it sort of all happened. And, you
were volunteered.
Yeah, exactly. You were sort of told that there are a couple of slots here. It might suit you well. So, they're looking for, and of course, that the army then had a bunch of commanding officers that would find the SI of the YOs when they were around Larkhill and say, the rugby team's really short of a scrum half. I've got an Olympic biathlete who needs an officer to go through the Nordic ski season. So if you've got any winter sports experts or I'm going on operations and therefore I've got to be the highest priority, we've all done that. But, they had a vote as well. So they had a vote. Yeah. The SI would say, well, it's funny you should say that. I've got this character on the course at the moment who might just suit you. And then, sort of this unofficial interviewing process would happen. But yeah, that, it's nothing more than that. And again, you're 22, you don't really know what's going on, and you're impressionable. You're up for exciting options, and somebody then tells you where you're going.
So where did you go?
So I went straight to 3rd. So I, myself and another good friend of mine who'd been in the same platoon as me at Sandhurst, Mike Harrington, he went to M Battery, the Eagle Troop, when they had guns, AS90s, and I went to D Battery. And that was, we arrived in, well, I think we finished the course in December, so we turned up after Christmas leave on the sort of 2nd of January in 1996.
To Topcliffe.
To Topcliffe, yeah.
Eye opener or not?
Yeah, it was an eye opener, but a blessed relief. Let's be honest, because you eventually got to your regiment, and I've been.
And you could slow down.
I was lucky going to D Battery because they were immediately going on a big exercise, or what I thought at the time was a big exercise. It sort of was in Yakima State, exercise trumpet dance. We don't do that anymore, but light gun exercise with the Cheshire Battle Group out in trumpet dance straight away. Get on live, some good enemy serials, dry, and a great experience really early doors.
I mean, to be fair, you were quite lucky.
I was very lucky.
The CP crews in D Battery then were really, really good.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant.
And I'm not just, I was J Battery then, so
Yeah.
I'm not just saying that.
I know.
It takes a bit for me to say it.
Dave Scammel's,
yeah.
He's in the same village as me now, and he's probably lives maybe 400 meters from where I am now. Who else do we have in this? Chippers Davis, bloody brilliant. Yeah. These people, Billy Henry, the signal sergeant, as a young officer arriving into that CP with Chippers as the bombardier, Billy Henry hanging around the back door of the CP, prepared to offer robust criticism to a young officer that might not have got the fire discipline right on the net. And somebody as laconic as Scams, running it was amazing. And these people, I've kept in touch with all of them because they were so formative. And they were strong. You're right. They were strong CPs.
Yeah, they were. I mean, I think the regiment at that time, that period, was because we'd just gone to AS90.
Yeah.
It was learning itself, and it was strong, and it was busy as well. I mean, I spent the most of '95 out of the country.
Yeah.
Had a course, and then we went to Jamaica on exercise, and then come back from that and went straight to Bosnia until like December.
No, and then stories of the Jamaica in particular, but also you forget that was we forget, our generation forgets that was an artillery where a battery in a regiment was a small cog in something that was massive.
Yeah.
And even if there wasn't, all of the mass that there had been sort of in the Detmold and depths of the Cold War, etc., they were still using the same procedures. And so in a CP, you will remember all of that. All of that race to be accurate and then report ready so that you could be given adjustment for the regiment, potentially for the whole of the offensive support group.
Yeah.
And this is something that I still reflect on to this day because it's now back in vogue. If you go and analyze or scrutinize or chat with the Ukrainian artillery commanders, this is one of the things that they're missing because they had an old Soviet system. They adopted that. They've had a bit of bleed across from Western stuff. But what was going on in the J Battery and the D Battery CPs, and C Battery would occasionally catch up, was the ability to race for adjustment, be technically accurate, and effectively have this competitive fast artillery system that was, I think we were all very lucky to go through that era.
Yeah, I mean, even when I was on the guns, when I was in 4-7 Regiment, just right back down to that level of the battery had come into action, and the competition instantly was the first gun report ready, camnet up, everything.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, we used to bring, like, I was on the Abbott, my first adult gun, let's say. I mean, I did my basic training on a 25-pounder, converted to light gun, and then got thrown onto an Abbott when I got the regiment. But we could have the Abbott in camnet up, and I'd say probably 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's not an exaggeration. There was we might not be ready to might not be ready to report ready because you throw in the dial sight out and everything like that. But we'd have the majority of the time, 10, 15 minutes, that battery would be ready to fire.
Yeah,
it's mental.
sad to report, the back end of my career, this was a lost art. I kept it going to a degree, where I could, where it was my responsibility to do so. But I found that this was, regarded as a sort of slightly old school lost art. And unfortunately, the Iraq and Afghanistan era were partially responsible for some of that large scale, conventional massed warfighting skill set to have been lost.
Yeah.
So don't think you've lost it forever, Frankie, because you could be coming back.
They'll have to find me.
This is where us as as retired regulars might be drawn back in.
I've just turned 55. That can forget it. But you never know.
You never know.
So your time at third, I mean, you've obviously enjoyed arriving there and being taught by some of the best. What about the rest of the time with the social aspect, the sporting aspect?
Yeah, so I was swept along, to be honest. So, you'll remember, I think probably shortly after that excising trumpet dance and some good, conventional firing on Salisbury Plain, away from Topcliffe, where it's really easy for us to do that. Then we went to Northern Ireland, 96. That meant that I didn't do the Nordic ski season with Dave Beelum. Fantastic bloke. One of the reasons I'm doing this podcast. I met him in spring 96. He took me to Rothymerster's Lodge for 2 weeks Nordic ski training. Brutal. Bear in mind, I'm not that long out of Sandhurst. That was very tough. And him having been to 2 Olympics, unsurprising. And then later on in life, he ended up as my second in command and sadly passed away. So, it's people like that you just never forget. He'd taken me through that. We then get thrown out to Northern Ireland. I had F Troop D Battery in Middletown and Keady for the whole of that tour. Amazing experience at such a young age. I'll be honest. I now sort of remember those memories when my son is getting to approximately the age that I was when I was commanding D Battery troops out there. And again, I was very lucky. I had Chris Reed as my TSM. I had some Richie Rogerson, Gary Cowan, Jimmy Hilton, Jace Bingley. I still remember all of these characters. They were all really really strong on what was a tough tour. You'll remember there was no ceasefire. We had bomb restrict on the tour, which hit everybody pretty hard. We had a lot of incidents, and Coops sadly took it up life. It was a tough old tour, and but that set me up. There's some things from that tour in 1996 that I was still, using either mentally or the deep preparation or the really professional kit checks and admin that we were all obliged to do, because that was what you did in Northern Ireland, and if you weren't doing it, you were regarded as unprofessional, so you just got on with it. Even weapon handling skills, because you had to do it so often, all of the time, and every patrol, dealing with your weapon correctly as you're going in and out of the butts, etc. I was using that up until the latter stages of my regular career. And I was surprised to find that there were other officers, particular, that hadn't been on a Northern Ireland tour, that were still having to, I would find people having to relearn how to put a rifle sling on, between regimental duty tours, because they'd never had one of those experiences where you were doing it, maybe 6 times a day. And it never leaves you. And so that was very formative for me. Came back from Northern Ireland 96, a lot more conventional gunnery, good stuff, big stuff. AS90 was relatively young then, absolutely purring, loved it. We did some, I don't know whether we went to Batters from Topcliffe, but then we learned that we were moving to Hona, went to Hona. I stayed with the regiment. It felt the right thing to do at the time, and I think it probably was for me, because I'd finished my first tour. I could have gone somewhere else as an FOO. I could have gone and done other things, but because we'd moved from Topcliffe to Germany, there were sufficient changes in life, different brigade, different battle groups to work with, different location, different life experiences to have. I decided to stay with Third. Because
is that an unusual thing to actually to get you go to FOO and stay within a regiment?
Yeah, I think it happened. It happened every now and again, but it was largely down to personal preference. I think if we'd have stayed at Topcliffe, I would have gone somewhere else. I probably would have chosen to gone somewhere else, but I was enjoying it so much in Third, mainly because of the soldiers and the role and the whole learning of what the Germany thing was, which I'm hugely grateful I experienced. Because even to this day, you bump into still serving senior commanders that they never did a tour in Germany. And so they don't really understand what it felt like to be part of, by then, one UK armoured division configured with, a bunch of brigades, all of the supporting assets and all of the C2 structures that was ready to go to war and was used to go to war quite regularly. 91.
The other thing is as well with the German regiment is that it becomes closer. The actual regiment becomes closer. The batteries become closer because they can't just bomb burst at weekends. So you end up with it's a different army. They are totally different. The guys in the UK and guys in Germany are totally different.
That's right. I couldn't agree with you more. And there is something really untangible about these things. And I tried to champion it later on in my career. So I did that. Great time as forward observation officer. We did Bosnia then. So I think 99 Bosnia, Mrkonjić I supported the Household Cavalry Regiment and Queen's Royal Lancers in the bus depot. But I had a J battery crew at the time, which was hilarious. So Mark Peake, Lee Draycott, Big, all of those lunatics. It was brilliant, and we had the freedom. We had our Warrior, we had the Warrior OPV, and we had 2 Land Rovers. And sometimes we would go on patrol with the squadrons, with the Armoured Corps squadrons in Land Rovers for a couple of days up into the hills. Sometimes we'd take the Warrior OPV out because we were live firing on Glamoch. But that was again very interesting. And then when we got back from there, Richard Barons has taken over as the CO. I was a bit spare because I've been asked to go and be the aide de camp to the Adjutant General. So I did a bit of ops stuff and helped him run a couple of exercises in Poland, which of course was pretty routine back then. Seems crazy to the current army based in the UK that you would just sort of chuck all your vehicles on the train, get off the train, go on exercise in Poland, then come home. It's now a bit more deliberate. But that's what it was. And then I came back to the UK to work for General Granville Chapman as his ADC for a year, which was hugely informative. Really enjoyed working with him. Not really my type of work, if I'm honest. I was probably the worst ADC possible, but it didn't mean that I didn't get a lot out of it. And after that, I had been selected to be the adjutant of 1st Regiment, but there had been an incident in Battus where an OPV had been shot up by a tank round and a captain had been injured, and they were going to rehabilitate him in the adjutant's job at 1st that he'd been from 1st. And that was I agreed that was the right call. If he'd been damaged and that was a place for him to rehabilitate, then he should get the job. So I got sent to 4th Regiment as the adjutant. Worked for an amazing commanding officer called Mark Neat, who remains a good friend. And he'd been in Sea Battery once upon a time, so he knew my third background and the people involved. And we had he had a tough time as CO because that was 2003, and so 3rd, 7th Brigade and quite a lot of augmentees, including from 4th, all went off to fight Telic 1, and I had my hand up really high to go and help. But we were slated for a Northern Ireland tour again, Londonderry, and also for the bloody fireman strike. So I remember being with Mark Neat in Otterburn Camp Alpha, watching TV with a dartboard and a couple of cans of Foster's, watching the 3rd Regiment and most of our 1 UK Armoured Division buddies go to conventional war in 1991 as we're just shaking our heads, drinking our warm Fosters, thinking, God, this is a very unfair world. But of course, that's the life of a soldier, isn't it? You want to be where main effort is.
I had a conversation with someone today, mentioning, more about what you spoke about before, and that came up about going to war, and she was like quite taken aback as to the same as probably one of the best times in my life. That you go, I was lucky in that respect that I got to do the first Gulf War and the second, but it's your job, and there's nothing better than it, and you're scared and stuff like that, but you go out and you're doing your job, and it's what you're trained for all your career, and to get to actually do it for real was amazing, I must admit. And there was people who got stuck back in the regiment who it affected them that they weren't going there. So I can imagine a lot of people. It'd been the same for the Falklands. A lot of people watching the guys going to the Falklands, thinking, "I need to be there. I want to be there." And they were never going to go.
Yeah,
it's just the way it is, like you say.
Yeah, well, it was hard to watch from afar, but they got the 18, and that was fair enough, and it all went well. All went well for you while we were doing the farming strike. So yeah, Mark Neat was, as I say, he was amazing CEO, and he's very good with his people, hard and generous to them. And my first child was born whilst I was just coming to the end of my time as adjutant there. So I got sent to another job in Wilton in what was then Land Command. First staff job I'd really done away from regimental duty, quite boring. But in that, I got promoted to major and went to another staff job in Northwood at PGHQ, Permanent Joint Headquarters, which was absolutely fascinating. And I loved it. And it really set the conditions for what I sort of expected and wanted from my staff experiences when I wasn't at regimental duty. And I think it's worth, so for the officer's career, if they don't work out the thing that they really love to do between regimental duty, it's actually quite dysfunctional for an officer, because they can't stay at regimental duty forever. It's just not the way their career model works. And I'd worked out that I like doing, operational planning and deploying to odd bits of the world. And I had some fascinating experiences as a young major doing that. I got sent to Indonesia to help the European Union put an insurgency to bed in Sumatra 6 months after the tsunami, living in a devastated Banda Aceh town with a Gurkha lieutenant colonel and a bunch of EU diplomats. And it was hugely fascinating. And, again, sort of we worry about sort of devastation and PTSD and all those sort of things, quite rightly so, because they're real and they hurt people. But that was that really put a lot of things into perspective for me.
Yeah.
It was a little peninsula of Indonesia with a main town, sort of, probably the size of Bournemouth, on a peninsula, a bit like Cornwall, that had been hit by a tsunami, and 60,000 people died in 90 seconds.
Bloody hell.
So, when, we, it puts a lot of other, statistics of death rates into perspective. 60,000 people in 90 seconds. And even by the time we got there, which was 6 months later, they were just coming to the end of almost an epidemic of people falling dead in the streets because of shock and heart attacks. So they were just literally picking bodies up of people that just couldn't deal with the stress of the horrific situation that happened. But those are the sort of jobs that I chose to enjoy between regimental duty. Then I went back to Command J Battery, back in Hona, 2007 through to 9. Amazing time, brilliant battery, brilliant people at the time. We were sort of slightly caught in the sort of emergence of Afghanistan and Herrick as the cool operation to go on, as Iraq was seen as the sort of normal jogging one that people had concerns about at the time, and I got sent with my battery back to Iraq. But we were going back there with the guns. We're going back there with our guns. We're going back there with AS-90, and that was our job. So we went over there, and we got on with the counter indirect fire role in Basra with batteries from 5th Regiment. So we had P battery from 5th Regiment with weapon locating kit, so Cobra and then Mamba. We had some, I should remember, I think by this stage, 4-7 Regiment had converted to Hermes 450. But we had the Hermes 450 battery with us, and you talked about, I think, Keith Field earlier.
Yeah.
Keith Field was one of those that had the exacta capability as well. So we had quite a nice, and we had a bunch of JTACs, including US JTACs in our team. We had, quite a potent fleet of weapons, and for a period of time, we used them. And it was the back end of what was then known as the Charge of the Knights, which was, politically challenging, but was actually there to try and resolve some of the problems around Basra. It did so. And we had an excellent brigade commander in 7 Armour Brigade at the time, who chose to try and restore some semblance of civilian order and remove the military instrument from everyday life. Yeah. Which was difficult to take as the commander of the artillery in Basra at the time, but it was the right thing to do, and he did it well. And I actually think that it's part of the Iraq story that is very poorly told. That the back end of Iraq, 2008 and 9, were actually quite a successful calming of the situation, to the point that that troops left, and that obviously focused the bulk of my time as battery commander. But again, I was lucky. I was lucky with the timing of my arrival. Literally my first week as battery commander was on CAT, the Combined Arms Tactics Trainer. You'll remember it down at Senlager.
Yeah.
Jump in a simulator, cabby around as a synthetic battle group and get your drills right. Do your Combined Arms Staff Trainer, get your battle group staff drills right. And then we went to Battus. with 4 Scots. And that was all in the preparatory phase for the operational cycle that then followed. Recover from that operational cycle, and my time as BC was coming to an end. And that so
I mean,
from
I've got to ask. I take it that you volunteered to go back to third as
yeah,
BC.
sure,
You didn't want to, yeah.
desperate to go back to third. Once I'd rather I'd set my stall out by saying I wanted to second tour as a young officer. So once I set my stall out, that's where I had determined, and therefore people saw I had declared as effectively my parent regiment, my home regiment, where I regarded as the people that I'd like to be around. And it's all about people. It's all about people, teams, and tribes. And once I declared that was my team and tribe, you know, I'd have been very disappointed had I not ended up back there as a battery commander. So after that, I went down to Hereford, to do what was called the Brigade Major Royal Artillery. So it's effectively the Chief of Staff of the Divisional Fires Organisation. So gathers all of the rockets, guns, radars, all of the various capabilities into the divisional thing, and helps the Commander Royal Artillery coordinate that for the GOC. Good job, quite intense, amazing exercises we put together in the Czech Republic, and I learnt loads. I learnt loads about the things that actually the Army of 2024 is trying to put back together. Some of it already does better than back then, some of it doesn't. And then it had a division that was really very good at this, not because of me or the team at the time, because it had done it for 2 or 3 decades, and it had just refined it over 2 or 3 decades in that guise. But it learnt from those that had gone before, and it got told to take it to conventional war in 91 and 2003, and that was the division that went. So, it had a bit of credibility about doing these things. So that was that was that. Then I went to be second in command of 1st Regiment Royal Horse Artillery, or as you and I know, the other regiment. Uh, uh, and that was good. But that, again, good people who looked after me along the way. That was because the CRA I was working for at the time, Dickie Alderby, basically said, if you want to command a regular gun regiment, you need another report from a regiment in your report book. So go and be 2IC of 1st Regiment. And they were just back from Afghanistan, so they were in sort of rebuilding mode. I did a bit of staff course after that, and then I went back to Northwood.
Where did you go for your staff course?
The advanced command and staff course I did at Shrivenham, so the UK advanced command and staff course, which again is an amazing year.
I mean, the only reason I asked that is that I thought that was the only place that it was done until I listened to a podcast a few months back and didn't realise that you got the opportunity to go to either America or India or some other places to actually do that.
There are a few others. And once upon a time, they were known as overseas staff courses. America, not so. That's pretty high profile. And there are a few others. Germany was quite selective. But the bulk go to Shrivenham on promotion with 40 other nations. And you learn as much from your international partners on that sort of course as you do from the subject matter. And of course, all from all 3 services. So the combination of a sort of joint network and an international network is pretty powerful and lasts with people for forever. And you keep in touch with them, and they all go through life and they all have trials and tribulations. We had a couple of Afghan students on our course who were obviously very highly thought of by the then Afghan army to be sent to Shrivenham to do the advanced command and staff course, and of course some of them were in pretty specialist organisations when they went back, and have had a tough time getting out of Afghanistan to settle back in the UK, and they have. So at least one of our HSC courses now settled back in the Midlands of the UK after a pretty testing extraction. But we had Chinese students on our course as well. I'm not sure that they attend these days, but there's really really very interesting, diverse gang on there, which was useful for me as I then went back to Northwood to the Joint Force Headquarters, as what was then termed the SO1 influence, so the senior officer grade 1 influence, which was effectively the targeting team, but it also meant that I had a responsibility to look after a bunch of countries in terms of crisis watch, effectively just keeping an eye on the circumstance. And I got North Africa, so
Wow.
shortly after the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia, mostly Libya, was very firmly on my radar for a couple of years. And I spent a lot of time in 2012, 2013 in and out of Libya post Gaddafi, when, it was chaos, but it was possible that this could have been recoverable, working with all sorts of, interesting diplomats and agencies, etc., putting together a whole series of plans, not all of which were enacted for various different reasons, but either way, hugely professionally stimulating.
I can imagine. That was really interesting.
It was very interesting, yeah, really interesting. And yeah, so I did that up until the point where I was privileged to take over command of Third, back in Ona again.
How did you feel about that? What was the joy like? Let's say.
But off the scale, but a huge responsibility, of course. And prior to it, the responsibility weighs more heavily because you're not getting on with it. It's not yours to do at that point. And of course, all you can think about is, all of the challenges and all of those that have gone before, and amazing, but often, and I think people, you hear this from other walks of life. There is this sort of crushing reality of the responsibility that is beholden upon the lucky that get privilege. And I was over the moon, and I was taken over from a good mate of mine, John Mead, and we were going to. I was, it was obviously slightly tainted because I spent a good chunk of my career either choosing unusual operations or being on conventional operations, whether it be short notice crisis things from Northwood or Northern Ireland, Bosnia, those more conventional things, Iraq, and I wasn't going to get that as commanding officer. But it was very clear, they'd just come back from a very testing Afghanistan tour, a 9-month Afghanistan tour. People forget that 7 Armoured Brigade at the time, I think, did the longest Afghanistan tour as a brigade. I may be wrong on that, but I think I'm right. And so that was it for Third. And my job was to dust them off after a testing 9-month tour and get them set for a move back to the northeast of England, where you are. And that was, and change role. So we were moving from AS-90 formally to light gun, even though they'd been using light gun in Afghanistan. Gather them together again, because of course a lot of people hadn't seen each other for some of them, with the training cycle that was prior to the Afghanistan tours. Some of them hadn't seen each other for over a year, a bit sort of 18 months for some of them. So gather them together, try and reform the regiment's spirit and atmosphere, re-roll formally, hand back all the AS90, hand back the barracks of Hona with a whole series of exercises going on at the same time, and then occupy Albemarle Barracks up in Northumberland, which you know well, as our new home, as a slightly dispirited community of MLRS 39 Regiment Royal Artillery, who we felt for, had disbanded as a regiment, was still basically living on that barracks as independent batteries. It was a very suboptimal C2 structure and not one I'd have chosen. But I didn't have a vote in this, and that's where we then turned up to try and live alongside them and together and settle through RHA in the northeast of England.
Bit of a different place than what they were used to, I must admit. I mean, I turned up there to go to 39, and I didn't miss the place until I left it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
it's out of the way. It was a bit ramshackled, to be honest.
Yeah, it was very. It hadn't been looked after. Like a lot of UK barracks that are independent garrison. The garrisons seem to get looked after. The remote locations don't. That's as remote as they come. The most northerly regular regiment in the British Army in England, but an amazing part of the country that took to, the families took to. People realised that actually you could have, you're from and live up there now, that you could actually settle and have a life up there, where a lot of southern garrisons just seriously expensive living, around those locations. So people started to put down roots and settle. We try to integrate as best we can. I think, if I'm really honest, my successors were much better at committing the time to getting involved with civil society. If my focus was to keep the gunnery going through the conversion of role and the unit move. I didn't want the batteries to feel like they could sort of park their professional role whilst they were all having a lovely time settling into the northeast of England. We did a bit of that, but I slightly focused on keeping up the skills, and to be fair, the batteries and the soldiers really they rose to that challenge, and it seemed like they wanted to do that as well. And we gave them some time off, and there was obviously a lot of sport to be done up there, and life to be lived. It's a great part of the country.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, it's close to Newcastle, so the lads can go out, have a night out, stuff like that. The countryside, there's lots of places around there. It is beautiful. I'll give it that. It's just the remoteness of that camp.
Yeah,
it was almost overbearing sometimes.
I'm told that they're spending some money on it now, but that place had not been invested in anything that was acceptable. On the unit move, some of that was masked because there was some money from the move budget, whatever that was, because they were saving so much money in Germany. It meant that they could spend triple SA on particularly sort of junior NCOs getting an allowance to live in a flat on the waterfront in Newcastle. And so there were a lot of people that were not complaining about the quality.
No, I bet they weren't.
They were living a good life. I think that dried up a little bit afterwards. Anyway,
39 did something similar for a while when they ran out of accommodation, that they put the senior full screws into Triple SA, but the only places they could get them was in Jesmond, where all the students were. So they loved it.
Yeah, they really did. And then unfortunately that came to an end. Without doubt, that will be the highlight, the professional highlight of my life for sure. And I'm happy to tell any future employer or current employers or people at whatever stage of life that the professional highlight of my life will always be commanding 3rd Regiment Royal Horse Artillery. It's negotiable, and I had an amazing time. Ups and downs, trials and tribulations. As you know, big family like that, it's not always straightforward. It's not always straightforward for the commanding officer. Some challenges in there, but without doubt, the highlight of my professional life for sure. And then I went to Mali with the United Nations for 9 months immediately after command, which meant I had to do my pre-tour training in my last sort of couple of months as commanding officer, and then deployed as one of two British UN folk in the force headquarters in Bamako in Mali for 9 months.
Wow.
And that was a hugely interesting experience on a very challenging UN operation, which is now shut down because the situation just hasn't allowed the UN to carry on with what was a pretty suboptimal performance. But to be fair, the circumstances were always against them. A big Al-Qaeda threat in a huge expanse of Sahelian desert, with a UN force of 11,000, and they were losing people quite regularly. I think 25 UN peacekeepers were killed during my 9 months, mostly on IEDs. But again, an amazing life experience, and that's sort of largely what I've sought out through my army career. I have some great friends that were out there. I still do some work with a charity that I got involved with while I was out there doing conservation for large wildlife in difficult parts of Africa. A charity called Chengeta, and the CEO of that organisation was my housemate while I was out there. A guy called Greg Murphy. He's doing an amazing job with them. So yeah, that was that. Then I did a bit more targeting with 3Div. Did a big exercise in the US called Exercise Warfighter 18.4, which seemed to go pretty well. It's a very good training event, very well delivered. Came back, got promoted, sent to Army Headquarters as full colonel to be the director of a program called the Land ISTAR, Intelligence Surveillance Target Acquisition and Reconnaissance Program, which is basically a new kit for the ISTAR community. And given what I've described before, that was really the first time that I'd been asked to settle down in a Army headquarters-ish type staff job. And I quickly concluded this was not for me.
Yeah.
It wasn't why I joined. I joined around people, teams, tribes, leading interesting operations. Done enough of those. Family was a bit threaders with me, always volunteering, going away on these things, and it just wasn't as exciting as I wanted, professional life to be. So I left the army in 2020, worked for a defence contractor for the past 4 years, and I'm just moving jobs now.
I mean, this might sound a strange thing to say, but after I interviewed Richard when he said he'd got his full colonel and moved to a staff job, he found it less. He never said it, but it seemed that he found it a lot less interesting. And
yeah, seriously, not.
You've gone from CO, and then you've got your full colonel. It's like that full colonel is like bottom of the rung, because it's like another army on top of the. It's like I don't know how to explain it. It's like going to sixth form as a young kid type of thing. You've got all the older boys there type of. That's quite a bad analogy, but it's the only one I can think of at the moment.
No, it's a good analogy, Frankie. It's a very good analogy. I won't go into all of the details, but I quickly concluded that whilst I was with my peers, at the point they said that I was not going to command soldiers again.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of the end. And for various things in my private life, my mother died. My wife had some challenges with her family that were short and brief, and all of these things sort of stacked up to
Yeah.
command soldiers again. I probably don't need to be going away on operations anymore in my late 40s because I need to be around my family. Kids
Yeah.
were the age that they were. Staff officer is very boring. Some of the behaviours there I wasn't comfortable with. And if I'm really honest, I hadn't been comfortable with the trajectory that the army had been heading for about 5 or 6 years, and it wasn't heading in the direction that I would like it to have been going. And so when somebody came and offered an opportunity which was quite exciting, I went for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the thing about command there. I remember seeing a thing. I think it was Slim who said it. There's 3 commands that an officer should do. One's the platoon, one's the regiment, and one's the army.
Mm,
And any other command from that doesn't matter, type of
mm,
thing. So I mean, that's like the 3 levels. Because you'll
mm.
always remember the first command.
Yeah.
The second command is like you've alluded to, that it's the best one. It's the greatest one you'll ever do to command your own regiment. And then
Mm,
to command an army. But I mean, that was the times of the Second World War type of thing. So there was more armies to command, I suppose.
yeah.
But yeah, so you get to that point where, like you say, you can't command, and if that's what you're bred to do, there's not much point, is there? Type of thing.
No, and there's also lots of other interesting things to do with life, and
Yeah,
I keep in touch with, all of our, former colleagues, those that are around. I've been working with some of them, from experiences in the army previously. I keep in touch with them, and that's great. And people always ask me, what do you miss? And I would say, the inevitable is that I miss not seeing the people every day, but I see them enough. So in
yeah,
many respects, I sort of don't miss them. I probably catch up with somebody from third or some other part of the army that I've been in, probably once a week.
it's a bit much.
Yeah, it is a bit much, but I don't see all of them. I just see, I see
Yeah,
one or two of them, or I chat on the phone with them, and that's important. And
yeah,
life's fragile, and we've talked about Dave Beelum, Kev Young, gone too early. He was my first
yeah. I mean,
friend.
both are shocked. I mean, I went to Dave's funeral,
Yeah,
and I was amazed at the attendance to
it
that.
was
I honestly was.
it was
I was blown away with it.
And these things are just a reminder that life is just so fragile and unfair,
Yeah,
that when you've got the chance to catch up, keep in touch, the good work that you're doing and documenting these stories. This
yeah,
is however many you've done these things. You're telling me you've done loads of them. What an amazing archive! And these things are important um, for people to just reflect, and some of them will be catching up with people. I know, talking about listening to Mark Peaks, one of your early ones. I sort of maybe see him occasionally when he's not banned from social media. But that's it. I probably haven't seen him for a while. I like to go to the reunions. I think the reunions are really good, particularly given the percentage of men that were involved in the regiments when we were serving. They're actually a really good men's mental health exercise. I know people have some fussiness about some of these things, but every time I've been there, and there's always one or two people who think, "Thank God I came along. I wasn't going to come along. I've come along.
Mm.
I've seen 5 or 6 people that I haven't seen for 10 years. It's been really good. And oh, by the way, I've stopped drinking. So, and they were really good. They didn't make me drink. These aren't always big piss ups now. So I'm a big believer on the formalised gatherings, whether it's a Remembrance Day parade, whether it's a reunion, whether it's going to the traditional events like Army Navy Rugby this weekend, or it's going
yeah,
stand down for the races or whatever it is. I think these things are actually very valuable in a way that they don't need to be. Doesn't need to be said. It's unsaid, but they are healthy for people.
I think you're right. I think one thing I suffered is I didn't want to go. I think I'd been out of the bubble for so long that it's like when you've not spoken to somebody and it's hard to make that first step to get back in touch. And for me to go to a reunion was like that. And I didn't go to one until they started organising the one in the Northeast, what they call a gathering. And I was going through my own issues at the time, and I got to that. I mean, I went down on the bus from where I live, and I nearly got off the bus twice to go back home. But I forced myself to go and met up with guys I hadn't seen for 20 odd years, and had a whale of a time. And I've been back to one since, and I'm trying to talk myself into going to Slaley Hall this year.
Yeah,
you know, it's.
I hope to be there.
I mean, I think I should.
I enjoyed last year. It was I got the train up from London. The place for dinner was literally 100 yards from the Newcastle train station.
Yeah.
Had dinner, good chat, and then we went round to the Spoons, and then I got the train down the day after. It was lovely.
No, I mean, if I turn up for this one, I'm bringing my recording kit. I'll just start grabbing people as they walk past. Sit down.
I think we should ban you from bringing your recording kit. That was very dangerous.
You never know. Yeah. So what's the future got for you then?
So I'm going to be working for a US defence contractor come Tuesday next week. Really interesting projects, right at the heart of what I hope to help the Army get back to some of the stuff we discussed earlier. You know, yeah. Goods, properly resourced, scaled, collective training, in a way that, you know, you and I would recognise working alongside battle groups and brigades, in the way that, you know, you saw it play out live in 91 and 2003. And, you know, I'll do that. Families all, you know, growing up, kids will be, you know, fledging in a couple of years' time, and
yeah.
You know, in Wiltshire, in a village where, as I said, you know, I bump into people every now and again because I'm not a million miles from, I'm not far from Lark Hill, and you know that's nice. You know, what I really want is to work hard for as long as I'm able to, but not so long that I can't enjoy, you know, having more time with the family when my hard-working primary school teacher of a wife decides that she's had enough of teaching in her 50s.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to go back to something you said about like the Army not changing its role or changing the way it works, its doctrine, its guidance, or whatever you want to call it. Do you think the Army's got to change back within, like, you know, because of the light of Ukraine and the threat from, the threat from Russia?
I think it is. I think that it's already done its own analysis, thankfully. I think it is moving back to where we would have recognised it. I think it's, you know, it's all on public record. You know, the current Chief of the General Staff is, you know, talking about, you know, how he wants the Army to relearn about more ground-based air defence, more ISTAR, more deep fires. So, you know, thirds, new rollers, rockets, absolutely the heart of that. And so I think it is, but what it hasn't probably completed yet is convincing a whole bunch of constituent stakeholders. Some of it's society. You know, heard all of the sort of shenanigans around politicians making a big deal about 2.5% of GDP. You know, what does that mean? How much money is that? It's sort of almost paper money. But the Treasury has got to be given the freedom to resource the MOD to reconfigure itself for the war that is most likely, because the alternative is unthinkable. It's either very painful or you don't go because others have to do it for you, and that makes you look weak as a country. So I think there is some of that, that constituency needs to be sorted. Politicians collectively need to understand defence better. We all know that there are a few of them that are strong on this, and because of the limited penetration of a small military around society now, they're on a whole load who know about this sort of scale of warfare. And then there is an internal community in the army that have grown up over the past 10 to 15 years, and they think that the apogee of the high point of good combat operations is high intensity counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan, and it's not.
Yeah.
It's 2 divisions in the field as part of a UK or a NATO or a US corps, and unfortunately, that sort of intensity of warfare means hundreds of casualties a day, thousands of rounds of munitions a day, probably tens of thousands, and a really hard, horrible fight.
Yeah.
That's not what any of those constituencies have been prepared for hitherto. I actually think the leadership is heading in the right direction. I'm just not sure that they're going to get the resource. They're going to get the buy-in from politicians, and it's for them to remind those serving that this is the way that it's going, and they need to learn from people like you and your generation, Frankie. And they should.
Yeah. I mean, the other issue they're going to have is recruitment. You're not going to get the recruitment to get the scale that we need unless you had bloody national service. Would that be a solution? I don't think it would be, but it may get to the point where that might have to happen.
No, I don't believe in the sort of national service, certainly for the first echelon. If we as a nation are pitted into a big NATO, defeat Russia type scenario, society will need to dig out second and third wave, not number. No. And that will mean that everything has to stop. That's when industry has to, cease focusing on, PlayStations and, shipping, Amazon boxes around, and sort themselves out to help a war effort. And, the industrial base in this country is another worry, and they're working on this, but they're working on it in the parameters of a peacetime country. And that's difficult. So, the recruitment is very, very difficult. I'm sure it's none of my business anymore. I do believe that simplicity in these things helps. I do believe in, the sort of narratives of the teams and tribes that you're catching in your podcast, Frankie, are, as important as, as jazzy, recruitment videos that, some people, certainly my generation, slightly miss the point. And it seems like a lot of people that they're trying to recruit miss the point as well.
Yeah.
Technology is going to change what the workforce requirement is as well. The British Army has just bought a gun, which I hope is excellent, which has a much lower, much smaller detachment. It will need just as many people to load the ammunition, for sure. It will need just as many people to do force protection. But actually, the platform itself has got a very small detachment, and that's no different for how you take the humans out of the crewed air vehicles, or you take them, take remote weapon stations onto the battlefield. If the army was really bold, it could bring a whole bunch of technology which is autonomous, uncrewed systems, which mean that the recruitment challenge doesn't look as acute for your fighting echelon. But you still need a lot of people around to to do a lot of the things that the humans have to do. So it's it's a wicked problem. It's a difficult one, and I don't envy their challenge.
No.
What we've probably got to do is we've got to help where we can, and I try to do that from defence industry, but also we should be respectfully critical from afar, and where we have got experience that might be relevant, we shouldn't be shy of offering it.
Yeah,
and
as long as they're willing to accept it as well.
Exactly. They've got to.
Yeah.
Then you've got to have the humility and the emotional intelligence of the organisation now to say, you know what, let's ask a diverse community from a previous generation that worked at that scale, or went through the operational experience that you have. Let's get in the whole forum of all ranks, and let's see where we can pick up some of these things, or them being asked to be pointed towards documents that were written in that era.
Yeah, change the ideas and change the doctrine.
Mm.
But it's again, I don't think that's going to happen overnight. The world's changing. I think Ukraine's opened everybody's eyes. At one point they were saying the tank's gone. We don't need a tank anymore. We don't need heavy artillery. The rockets can just do everything. And I admit, rockets could probably do everything, but the amount of money it costs. But to see what happens, the Russians haven't changed their doctrine from the Cold War. By the look of it, they're starting to now. If you watch what's happening in Ukraine, things are changing. And the Ukrainians are on the back foot now, unfortunately. And I think that will pan out that way. I think the Donbass and stuff like that, I think that the river will be the next, that'll be Ukraine's border in the future. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, it probably should have happened previously, and then we wouldn't be in the situation where we're at now.
Yeah, so what we've got,
is, yeah.
I think the determining factor over the next 12 to 18 months, as many people are reflecting on, is industrial capacity. We've just got to keep supporting.
Yeah.
Right. We've got to keep shipping them. Some of it that not very advanced. Just ship them ammunition. They just need loads of ammunition, and get them the mass back, or replace the mass and help them thicken themselves out. Because Russia has done this. Russia has simplified its industrial base. It is gone back to not quite, but close to a conflict economy. Not quite a full scale whole of state war economy, and those things matter as much as what tactics you're using on the ground.
Yeah. Right, I think we've come to the end of this podcast then. We've covered some areas there that I wasn't expecting to, but it was quite enjoyable. I've got to say thank you again for coming on and telling us your story, and I am sure there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who remember you fondly and have got other stories that obviously we can't talk about and hear about you, and
Yeah. Let's keep those for another time, Frankie. Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, thank you. If there's anything else you'd just like to say to anyone.
No, well, I've done this because of what you're doing, and listening to the other stories that have been told. So, some people have a hard life, both serving and many people when they've left, and I'm grateful for what you're doing. For telling those stories, and those people that we've lost too early in their life. The reason why I've come on to tell my frankly pretty boring but privileged story that's been an absolute joy. And I hope other people come and join you and tell you theirs, because it's important.
Yeah, I'm about to do another round of recruiting because I've run out of people to talk to at the moment. I've got a few lined up that have come to talk to me about other things and stuff. And I'm hoping to get some other interviews where I go out into some veterans clubs and stuff like that and talk to people.
Names for you. We'll talk offline. I'll give you a few more that need picking up.
Right. Yeah. Right. I'll end the recording now. Again, thanks very much, and we'll speak soon.
Cheers, Frank.